McDonald is a data alchemist at Spotify, where he spends his time turning interesting data into meaningful and useful data, or sometimes vice versa. Several of his attempts to explore and organize awe appear at Every Noise at Once, which is everynoise.com, or on his blog at Furia.com. And his presentation today will be New Approaches to Music as Information. So please welcome Glenn.
So, I'm not knowingly a music librarian, but we do have this large collection of music at Spotify, which I guess qualifies as a library. And I do spend a lot of time trying to understand and organize it. So I may do the same kind of things that you do, and maybe I don't. And I'm going to attempt to describe what I do enough that you can then ask questions that will lead to interesting answers. So we have somewhere on the order of 30 million songs on Spotify by 3 million artists, about. And this is a different music world than the one I grew up in. I grew up in one where the way you explored music was you went to Sound Warehouse. You had to ride your bike very carefully because you had to cross a highway to get there. And you walked in, and to one side was classical or jazz, whatever the music that I didn't care about, and the other side was the music I cared about. And it was all alphabetized, and you flipped through bins of plastic-wrapped cardboard things that were about like this EAB. And they all made the same sound, the sound of plastic-wrapped cardboard shifting in a bin. But they had other sounds inside of them, which you had to imagine by looking at them, or having heard them already, and eventually you could maybe buy one. And if you were me, didn't have much money, that eventually was a pretty long period of time, but it would come around. And I remember at the time thinking that, you know, when I grow up, I want to have like one of those jobs where you get paid a lot of money so I can be rich. And my definition of rich was I could buy a new album. No, be crazy. 2 new albums every single month. So I'm happy to say that my successful software career brought me to that level of wealth somewhere about age 23, and then I was like, well, now what do I do? And then something changed, and Napster came along, and then iTunes, and this shift happened where the things weren't wrapped in plastic and in cardboard, they were online. But I think we are now actually in the real shift. The interesting shift, I think, is not about the form the music takes, but it's about the nature of the experience. And the beginning age of digital music remained for a while a shopping experience. It was a digitally intermediate shopping experience, and you could listen to samples, and so it was in many ways better than flipping through albums. But the mindset was still the same. There is this marketplace, and I have ways to browse through it and then choose to make a transactional decision to take something from that marketplace into this space where I can listen to it, into my collection. And that is the thing that we are only slowly understanding has gone away, that shopping layer. The 30 million songs on Spotify, which clearly when Spotify first launched were treated as a marketplace, we now sort of are slowly understanding they're not a thing that you can extract stuff from. They are like an ocean of music that you can wade into and splash around in, and that we can pipe to you, and you can experience, in a sense, directly. And knowing what that changes is really interesting. So things like, Spotify recently added a running feature where if you have your phone with you, you can run, and it can detect your speed of your footfalls as you're running from the accelerometer on the phone. So you tell it beats per minute, we know what kind of music you like, and we can actually pull from this vast database and pipe you songs at 165 beats per minute that are by bands you know, or bands that we think are similar to the bands you know. If you had to do that in the old world of shopping for those things, you wouldn't do it. You would have no way, like, unless someone made a compilation album specifically for you of songs at 165 beats per minute, which no one could do, there's no way to do that. It was It was possible in a theoretical sense, but not in a practical sense. So a lot of what I spend time doing is trying to figure out how to make this new reality make sense. Like, how do we actually know what you like? Do you like different things when you're running than when you're studying? How do we know which of the things you really like, or what you're listening to them for some other reason, like your kids like them? So that is sort of my general mission, and I fiddle with a lot of things in service of that. And I have a bunch of amazing sources of data. So the first one, of course, is this catalog of music. And it comes, large amounts of it come from the 3 major labels worldwide. But then a lot of it comes from independent artists uploading stuff to CD Baby or 1RPM or any number of distributors, which gets it to us. And all that stuff is, of course, meticulously tagged with artist names and song titles and tempo, durations, and a bunch of other stuff, which is all amazing information, except that you can't trust it at all. Like, most of it's right, but any individual piece is liable to be wrong, and confidently wrong. Like, it's not like anything is marked like, maybe the name of this band is Hate. No, it says, this is Hate. This is the band Hate. Like, I love them. They're a Polish death metal band that I love. And then starts like, this is not a Polish, this is like some hip-hop guy from Oakland who decided to go by Hate. Like, no, he's very good at what he does, but I'm looking for the thing. So we spend a lot of time trying to make that information, trying to compensate for the fact that that information is cheerfully precise, but cheerfully inaccurate. And separating artists and annotating, and every release comes to us with its release date, except that the people putting the release dates on it are the labels issuing it, and what they care about is the release date of their product, and what we care about is the provenance of the actual music. And so we know that Frank Sinatra did not release any albums in 2015. But yet a query will happily produce a bunch of Frank Sinatra albums from 2015 that are sparkling and new. So it takes a lot of work to make that into a usable form. And then the second fascinating source of data we have, and so I worked at a startup called the Alchemist in Somerville that was bought by Spotify a year and a half ago. And the Alchemist mission was to understand not just the music, but how people talk about it online. So we still run the things we always ran. We scrape millions of web pages and blogs and music review sites, and Twitter feeds, and like everything we can get our hands on every day, and associate it with songs and albums and mostly artists. And so we have this vast corpus for any artist, pretty much. We can tell you how people talk about them and what terms are used disproportionately with those artists. And that, too, is an amazing source of highly precise and often inaccurate data, because although we do a fairly good job of knowing when an article is about music and when an article is about a band, even when an article is about the Polish death metal band Hate or the Oakland rapper Hate, things are often wrong. The terms, some of them are fairly ambiguous. The term polka almost always means the musical form, except sometimes it's used to describe a kind of relationship dialogue, and so that's confusing. But lots of, like, rock and pop are used all the time in not their technical senses. So that data is super useful in mass and problematic in every individual case. You don't have to worry about that. And then another thing we did at the Alchemist, we still do, is we actually have machines listening to music. Except, of course, machines don't listen to music, they do math. But we have them do math that simulates listening to music. And so we do a lot of both signal processing to understand sort of objective things about the music, like its dynamic range and its loudness, but also a lot of machine learning-driven analysis of music to try to guess at psychoacoustic features like energy and danceability and emotional valence. And these are all done by having humans tag and answer these questions about a few thousand example songs. Is this a happy song or a sad song? Is this a song you could dance to or not? And then the machines say, well, if those 1,000 songs, if these 500 are high energy and these 500 are low energy, then we think that the cues of that and the things that the machines can interpret about the bits of the music mean that, you know, of our 30 million songs, these 15 million are higher energy than these 15 million. And usually then we go back and look at that and go, well, that was often right, but like, oh my God, all the polka came out as low energy even. It's high energy, and that was because we didn't put in polka in the training set. There's something different about it in a statistical sense. And so we train some more polka songs, and those get better. And we keep doing this. And then the last source of data we have is Spotify has 75 million-ish active listeners every month. And those people listen to music a lot. And humans tend to listen to music. They tend to have tastes in music, and so they tend to listen in a non-randomly distributed manner to the ocean of 30 million songs. And those patterns are interesting. And we know a little bit about all those people, so we, I think, again, in a highly precise but not always accurate manner, we know exactly what gender they clicked on the form, whether that's their gender or not. We know exactly how old they say they were. We know exactly where their internet host's IP address supposedly is located, which is often accurate and sometimes not. And so the combination of all those things can produce a bunch of interesting patterns. And sort of the main sort of bedrock of our organizational system that all this stuff feeds into is a graph of artist similarity. So for every band, we want to know who is similar to them. And that's a combination of cultural, you know, this is this band formed by the bass player or grew up next to the other band or something. It could be genreish, these two bands have never heard each other, but they both play polka. It could be historical, this band was highly influenced by this band, but whatever. We just mash all those concepts into this one graph that says the nearest bands to Muse are these, the nearest bands to Steve Earle are these. And then we can build a bunch of stuff on top of that. And so one time, long ago at the Alchemist, one of our customers, or another service running a music streaming thing, said, "We got all this data. That's great. We want to do genre playlists. So we want to be able to like make an API call and say, give me some rock music." And we said, "Well, you know, you people, it's more complicated than that, but we can translate your naive request into precise database terms. What you want is, tell me the most popular current artists for whom rock is a disproportionately occurring descriptive term, right?" This, whatever. And we said, "Great, here we go." And we hit play, and it played Rihanna, and we looked like idiots. And we're like, okay, it's true, rock is a term that is often even disproportionately used to talk about, you know, in discussions of Rihanna. But what we realized at that point was we constructed this massive database that expressed the importance of a given term to a given artist. And it's actually not the same to turn that around. To ask the relevance of a given artist to a given term is actually a different question. And so we set about modeling that. And the way we did it, because we had this graph of artist similarity to work from, is we said, all right, for any given genre, you tell us what you call it, and you tell us some artists that qualify what you mean. So if what you mean by rock is Creedence Clearwater Revival and The Who and Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin, so, okay. We can start from those four artists and maybe a few more to make it a little more coherent. And we can find the neighborhood in the artist similarity space that those artists occupy. We can find the other artists that are collectively near to them. So although you know, there may be some southern rock bands that are similar to Creedence Clearwater Revival, but they're not as similar to The Who or Led Zeppelin, but there are other bands that are a little less, but commonly similar. And so by sort of collective extrapolation, we can figure out with pretty good results, if these four bands are who you mean, then here are 200 more that are also what you mean. And this, the goal of this is to be able to produce a listening experience to go with that premise that makes sense and can sort of continue indefinitely it's not to be comprehensive. Like the extrapolation we did for rock was one of the biggest ones, and it has about 500 artists that we consider strongly representative of rock. Clearly there are more like 100 or 200 or 300,000 bands on Spotify, let alone the world, that you could call rock bands. But there's no way to have a coherent listening experience to 30,000 bands, because you will never get through them. And you probably want to hear the ones you like again before you never get through them. So it makes more sense to just have a listening unit that we call rock, that's all rock, even though there's other rock. And so I started doing that, and at the point where I started doing that, our marketing people said, well, if we're going to have this list of genres, we've got to have at least like 100 or something. And I said, 100? Like 400? There must be 400 genres. And so when we first put it up, there were like 420 or something. At that point, I knew I wasn't done. Like, there's got to be, I'm sure there's a few more. Probably 500. At the point where I got to 600, I'm like, I'm not quite done. But it's getting close. We got nearly 600. That's a lot of genres. How much music is there in the world? A question which I shouldn't have asked in that tone. And so at 800, I thought it's possible we'll get to 1,000. There are 1,387 on the list so far, and it's only the progress is only slowed because I've been distracted in other things, I think. My notion of what constitutes a genre is like deliberately undisciplined. It could be historical or regional or a genre in the musicological sense, or increasingly fine distinctions between things just because there's a group of artists that are associated with each other more strongly than they are with something else. Most of the time these things have names in the world that I can just use. So like future pop is a thing that I didn't name. Someone called it future pop, and there are bands that identify themselves as future pop or that are identified on their behalf by critics as future pop. And then sometimes there are things that don't quite have names. So this dark electro-industrial, that's not exactly a name that's in currency, but it's a cluster I found that was electro-industrial music, but it sort of sounds darker than the other one, and I have to give you unique names, otherwise you'd never be able to tell apart. So I used my vast creativity to call it dark. Only when I can't think of a boring name do I resort to interesting ones. So there are only a few of those. So we have all these genres, and we have all these acoustic things that we're trying to learn about energy and danceability and stuff, and it's hard to tell if that's working, or it's hard to tell how well that's working. Like you can pick a song and say, well, do the scores look right on this song? But trying to figure out a way to sort of debug that in aggregate, I had this idea, well, I've got these genres, I can calculate sort of average values for all the songs by all the artists in these genres, and then maybe we could plot them. Like maybe we could plot energy versus danceability and see like where the outliers are, to try to find the cases like we didn't train enough polka examples, so the polka is all getting scored wrong. And so I built this like scatter plotting thing that would score the genres and make these graphs of them. But of course then all the names fell on top of each other, so you couldn't read them. So I had to write some code to like space them out so I could actually read the genre names. And at some point when I was doing it, I'm like, I kind of accidentally made a map. Like it's kind of interesting to browse this. And so I published it, and then people liked it, and so here it is. And the way this, so people often think, people who've seen things like this often think that it's like a force network, which is a kind of graph where you have pairwise distance scores for each thing, and then you do complicated math to sort of lay them out in such a way that it is most closely aligned with all those distances. And this is not that. This is actually just a scatter plot of two values, then adjusted so that you can read them all. And the values here, there's like 13 of these audio dimensions that we use for analysis, but the ones I'm actually using in the map go from, at the bottom, this is what we call organicness. So it's human, not regular timing, and acoustic instrumentation. So like harp music is sort of the epitome in classical piano, you know, human dynamic control and variation, and very gentle and acoustic tones. And as you go up, things get both more electric and more mechanical. And once you get up to the bottom, to the top corner, you get deep tech house, which is like, except it goes on for like 12 minutes. And then the left-right axis, the left axis, it's sort of sonic density. So on the left edge are things that are very sonically dense, and so things like classical organ, which is like very solid, not a lot of space in the music, it's just like washes of sound. A more electric version up here, you get a lot of very extreme metal forms. Like constant, just crazy, just walls of noise. You can hardly make out what's going on at all. And then as you go to the right, it gets sort of sharper and bouncier and more space between the notes. So things like reggae and hip hop, and in the extreme down here, spoken word things like reading aloud and motivational speeches and poetry readings, which, you know, there's tons of space between the notes, which are bits of sound. So you found these very interesting sort of areas of this universe when mapped that way. So as I said, the top corner, top right corner is all modern dance music, electronic dance music. And you get sort of angrier versions across the top, sort of more mellow versions down the side, and then you skirt this top coast, and the anger, as you get away from the machine version of anger, you get into the human version of anger. And so there's a metal cluster, punk over here, and then the aggression of metal kind of, when it intellectualizes, turns into drone and noise music, and eventually you get down to classical here, and then you go up the other side, and you get blues all down here on the bottom, and funk and sort of Latin forms, and then eventually you get to the right coast of hip-hop, and on your way back to dance music. And because this map is a projection of just 2 of these 17 axes, or 13 axes, especially in the middle, the things that end up next to each other are sometimes related. So like music for kinderen is Dutch children's music, and kinder music is German children's music. And so they're near to each other, which makes sense. But Russian hip-hop is actually in between the two. So eventually, I fiddled for a long time with how to usefully use color in this, and eventually I found a way to map 3 of the other of those 13 dimensions into the red, green, and blue channels, so that the color kind of gives you a clue when you're seeing proximity in 2 dimensions that's not necessarily representative of all the dimensions. So I don't know if you can see this, but those 2 children's music ones are kind of green, and the hip-hop ones are kind of reddish. So you can tell there's kind of 2 different spaces that may be like this, but you're seeing them like this, so they seem superimposed. And then you can sort of reverse, if you follow like the little purple things, you can see abstract IDM and ambient IDM and glitch, which are all sort of mellow background kind of electronic music, are kind of tied together by their color, even though they're sort of separated in the map. And that was cool, and then it occurred to me, well, I bet I could make, having made maps of genres, I bet I could make maps of the artists in a genre. And so then I just used the same code and pumped the artists in instead of the genres. It was like, whoa, okay, that sort of worked, that was cool. At the artist level, within a genre, you're often dealing with a much tighter acoustic space. So sometimes, basically, all these artists sound the same, but we have to fill the screen with them because otherwise they'd all be in the middle. So sometimes these genre level maps are not actually as interesting. But The other thing I did was, I could do a little sort of neighborhood map, take just the genres that we think are closely related, and by that we mean a combination of cultural relations, which means artist overlap. So like ambient IDM and abstract IDM share a bunch of the same artists, and some that are not shared. But we can combine that with acoustic similarity between the genres. So ambient IDM and gamecore probably actually may have no artists in common, or easier to think about like Finnish hip hop and Portuguese hip hop have, as far as I know, no artists in common. Once I say, I should have looked it up beforehand. Now there will turn out to be a Finnish/Portuguese hip-hop fusion curriculum. But probably they have no artists in common, but they sound very similar. So by combining these two vectors, we can get a good combined similarity metric. So these are only the genres that are actually close to ambient IDM. And then, because I have all this math, I've always thought, I wonder if I can figure out the opposite of a thing. Like if I hate a kind of music, like that could be a discovery vector. Because I'm like, I hate everything about this. In fact, if everything were exactly different, I bet I'd love that. Which I initially tried to do by sort of, because I could calculate distances between any two genres. So I just said, well, from any genre, the farthest thing away must be the opposite. Only when I did that, I found that every genre's opposite was either people reading poetry aloud, satanic black metal, classical piano, like piano competition winner piano, or that deep tech house in the top right corner. Because they were just so far from everything else that dominated everything. But eventually I had a better idea, which was, if you think about this 13-dimensional space, I'm sketching a globe, which is 3 dimensions, but imagine that I were somehow able to wrap my hands around 13 dimensions. For every point that a genre represents, for each one of those 13 dimensions, you can project them through the origin of the globe and find the thing, the point on that axis, which is equally distant from the center, but in the opposite direction. So if your genre mainly consists of slightly faster than average music, you get one that's slightly slower. If your genre is much more drum machine driven than the average, you get a genre that is much less drum machine driven. And that turned out to be, I don't know, useful would be a stretch, but reliably entertaining. And so this black inverse map is going through the center, digging through the center of the globe and coming out on the other side. And we see that the opposite of whatever are we looking at, ambient IDM or something, is blues rock, which actually sort of kind of makes sense. And then, having done all that, I just kept doing other things. And so at the bottom of this is everynoise.com, and at the bottom of it there are a whole bunch of other things that have gradually accreted that we can learn by looking at genres. So we can, for example, take all these genres and map them into the countries of origin. So we can see what music people make most distinctively from individual countries. So the most American of music genres by this score is Columbus, Ohio indie music, which it fucking better be. If our data indicated people in Poland were making that, then I'm going to be showing you. And so, the size of these tells you a little bit about the sort of cultural legacy of these countries, and a lot about the modern streaming music business and where Spotify is in service. So by the time we get over here and things start getting a little thinner, it's not quite that not very much music is made in Mali. That would be silly. But the music that is available streaming and that we know about from our attempt at scraping the world of music that is inevitably Eurocentric, basically clusters into only 5 of these things. And also for these genres, I'm trying to, the threshold I want is like, there are at least 100 artists who could plausibly be said to work in this genre, like, not all the time, but most of the time. And so that you could like make a radio station that just plays all the time and plays this stuff. So there's plenty of genres that are both, that are real, but consist of only a few bands, or that are real, but that consist of a proud history of music that mostly hasn't been digitized and made available on the stream. So I have this list back at home of the genres that I know are real, but haven't been able to represent in this space. And there's a lot of African traditional forms in there that just aren't at this scale yet. The other interesting, funny thing that we can do, so that was looking at the origins of the music, but we can actually look at music by where people are listening to it. And then, because I was making a map that wasn't geographical, I actually made a non-geographical map of geography. So this is the same code that moves the genres around, the same two axes. Actually, I think I flipped them. That's the same two variables plotting the aggregate acoustic properties of the music that is popular in these countries. And what we discover here is an acoustic Scandinavia across the top, of which Australia and Canada and Japan are part of, in addition to the countries that you think of as part of political Scandinavia. So this is the cold, austere, beepy parts of the world. And then at the bottom, you get the bouncy, relaxed, fun-loving parts of the world, which unites Africa and the Caribbean in a compelling way. And then a bunch of stuff in the middle. And then having started to look at the sort of cultural acoustic properties of the listening of countries, I then went to do it for cities. And these ones I didn't map, there are too many of them, but I have this thing that looks at all the listening over the past month or so by where it comes from and finds not the most popular things. So this is funny. The reason I started on this actually was I'm interested in music from all over the world. And when we got acquired by Spotify, I'm like, awesome, we have, like, there are people everywhere, there's music from everywhere. And like what are they listening to in Taiwan? And I went to the Taiwan Top 50. And I said, well, what is the most popular song in Taiwan right now? Does anybody recognize this song yet? It is, of course, the famous Taiwanese singer Justin Bieber. Other famous Taiwanese singers on this list are Ellie Goulding and Ed Sheeran and The Weeknd and Maroon 5. I'm like, that's not, yes, people love Justin Bieber in Taiwan. That's not what I meant. What I meant is like, what are people listening to more in Taiwan than elsewhere? And so this is this thing I constructed to do that for every city in the world that has enough Spotify listening that is different, enough different from the rest of the world to sort of register. And so there's like 1,000 cities on this list, and you can find out what they're listening. And this thing doesn't use any metadata about the artist, so it doesn't know that these are Mexican artists. It just knows, all right, these are the songs that people are listening to in Mexico, disproportionate to the rest of the world. And then when you cross-check it, you find out, oh yeah, these are Mexican artists. This is actually doing the thing that I wanted to know. And then you can, because we now have these acoustic profiles for what the listening looks like in a given city, I can then sort the entire universe of cities by how similar they are to any other one. And so if you take Stockholm as the middle of the universe and look, this one is actually looking, because so many of these don't share any artist overlap, this one's just looking acoustically. So if we sort the world by its acoustic similarity to what people listen to in Stockholm, then the cities with the most acoustically similar distinctive listening are mostly in Germany, and then there's some Swedish ones. And we could actually say, no, what I want to know is the US city that is closest to Stockholm in acoustic nature. And that's actually Richmond, Virginia. And probably there's almost no artists in common there, but there's similar feeling to it. And then there are playlists for all these too. And one last thing before I start taking questions. So all these genres, I now know thousands of songs that I have high confidence, statistical confidence, are in the genre, which again is cheerfully precise and sometimes inaccurate. But in aggregate, like if 1% of those are wrong, then it doesn't really matter for my purposes. And so I said, well, let's take all the words in the titles of all those songs and look for the words that are disproportionately used in each genre. And so we get things like, in a cappella, the words that show up more than you would expect in titles are medley, love, somebody, your girl, home, time, overwhelmed with when need around life, what tonight's song. And if we look for country, straight old country music. Country, love, cowboy, drinking, that's hard good. Like thinking just she's the little this what goodbye Texas with. If we go the other way and like look for which genres mention trucks, we get honky tonk, where common words are honky tonk, Texas, truck driving, country, lonesome. This is in strict frequency order. Like I didn't do anything to make these make sense. Modern country rock is also big on country beer, and whiskey, love, good, like cowboy truck. It's almost a line from a song. and each of these you can actually click on it and it will reverse the thing, and you can see like which genres use the word whore. Well, only in slam death metal does it show up disproportionately in the titles of songs, which is useful information because you might reasonably decide not to listen to that stuff. So there's a variety of things at the bottom of the page that goes on and on like that. And that is the thing, that is a bunch of the things that I do. What else can I tell you about my work? Questions?
Have you made any attempt with the genres? Are you just relating them to one another using the 13 axes that you've identified? Or is there anything more systematic about how you're relating genres to one another?
That is a great question, and one that has been asked of me many, many times, usually with less politeness than that. Usually it's asked more like, where is the hierarchy? Can you show me the tree of these genres? I say, well, no, it's not really a tree. And how individual genre here relates to some notion of a higher level thing depends a lot on what you mean by a higher level thing. So we have people who look at this and say, well, just tell me the hip hop, like all the hip hop. I say, really, you want all the hip hop? Because I can give you all the hip hop. But you want Finnish hip hop? Like, no, not Finnish hip hop. All the real hip hop. Okay. You go. I'm going to give you a pad of paper and a pen. You go write an essay on what's real, and come back to me, and I'll try to help you make that happen. Yeah. So I have resisted / tried multiple times to make sensible hierarchies out of this, and always at the end gone back to that's worse than not doing it. So the space is flat, the genres are all independent of each other in their construction. Bands can be in any number of them. Most of the bands, there are like 180,000 bands who qualify as representative of something on this list. And of those, like 2/3 of them are only in one. And then there's this sort of Fibonacci-like descent or exponential descent. Canned Heat and Mercury Rev and a couple like Muddy Waters are in 20 or 21 of them. It's like a handful, very small number that are in that many, and it goes like this. And so for individual purposes at Spotify, people say like we're trying to make a rock chart, and we just need to know who's in it. And I'll sit down with that person and say, all right, what do you mean by rock? I've got 1,387 genres, and you can have any number of them. Let's talk about what bands you mean. And they say, well, that sounds good, but I don't have time. You just do it for me. And so I do it, and then I complain about it. And then we find time to actually help me.
So your process is more inductive, that you get at the genres by saying, well, what do you think you want to hear? Like, give me examples.
Yes.
You drill in that way to get the relationship.
Right. And the mechanism that does all this because it just starts from, here are some genres that we mean, here's some artists that we mean to go together, we can also apply it to things that have nothing to do with this sort of shared genre space. So we do it for personalization too. We can take all your listening, we can cluster it according to this artist similarity, and then we get, this is the kind of black metal that you like, which the center of that may be a little different than the black metal that we have here, but we can do a collective extrapolation from the 9 black metal bands that you listen to most and get a different neighborhood of the space than the one we have labeled, including when we haven't labeled at all. If you have a bunch of things that we've never heard of, but they go together in some way that you know about, we can figure that out, again, without having to fit it into any kind of taxonomy. Obviously, I have the luxury of not having to answer to any kind of academic anything. So, like, nobody grades me on anything other than, did people listen more to Spotify? Did more of them decide to pay?
I see your division by genre and I see geography. The one thing that I don't see, and I'm wondering how much this affects people's listening habits, is chronology. That is, people who grew up in the 80s may actually be like to cross-genre listen for 80s music.
Yeah, so that factors in heavily to the listening patterns that inform this. So many of these genres on this list are actually historical. Like New Wave is not an acoustic profile. Its acoustic profile it shares with a bunch of like indie-tronica and Swedish synth pop, for example. Those are 3 things that sound about the same, but to be Swedish synth pop, you have to be Swedish. To be New Wave, you have to belong to this particular period in history. You can still be making music, but you can't become a new wave band in that sense today. So yeah, it's kind of not dealt with explicitly, but happens naturally by the patterns of listening.
I notice on this slide you have classical piano, concert piano. Does your work extend to Western art music, what we call classical music, and you're doing the same thing that you're doing for the other kinds of music?
I'm doing totally the same thing. There is some obvious weirdness in the classical world, because, and this applies to both metadata and listening, because like roughly half of it is primarily identified by its composer and roughly half by performer. So for example, there are like classical performance here is basically the same music as classical period, but the classical period is like composer-oriented. It's a cluster of composers, and the classical performance is a cluster of performers. I think and you can tell by the fact that the classical cluster is like this big, and there's like 20 or 30 things in it, and there's like 89 kinds of metal and 100 kinds of EDM, that the music space I'm dealing with is very heavily biased, both in listening and in online discussion, to modern music. And the data we have about classical music is poorer, and so it's harder to make fine distinctions. So, like, my list of classical forms that I know are real things that I haven't been able to differentiate is also wrong. And in most cases, they're not here because, like what was once, like spectralism, for example. Like, I know it's a real thing. I know 10 composers who work in spectralism. If you extrapolate from those 10 composers to 200, you just get a bunch of modern composers. They're not spectralists. So I can't do any better yet, but I'd love to be able to. But yeah, it's all done exactly the same way. And there are funny things that happen, like I use the same playlist generating code to generate example playlists for this, which is great for modern music and often kind of silly for classical music. Like if the intro to these is likely to have like the fourth movement of some symphony. Like the top 10 songs, 6 of them will be the fourth movement of the same symphony, by different performers or with different composer credits or something. So it's useful to explore, but not to listen to.
Could I follow up? What does the word deep mean when you're talking
Deep,
about
right, so
operas
I was talking
and
about my attempts to name these things with as little creativity as possible. So when I have a cluster of something that's basically the same as a well-known cluster, but more obscure, and I can't think of any, I can't find any way to distinguish the music in terms of what it is. I'm just like, all right, it's deep, whatever. So classical piano is classical piano. Deep classical piano is like the second division of classical piano. Like you just haven't heard of them, but if you listen to classical piano and you're done with it, then I got more for you.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay.
I have a question about, so the model for Spotify, I mean, for most of these streaming services, is to offer music that's similar, right, to what you were already listening to. Have they done any testing with offering the complete opposite and seeing if people have any interest in?
So we haven't actually used these genre opposites yet in a production test, but we want to. Our casual tests have suggested that is an interesting exploration path, but most people don't respond immediately positively to it in mass. The sort of saving grace here is that we're not quite good enough because we recommend a lot of stuff. Like Pandora has a different model, and you train a Pandora station, it will end up with like 8 bands and the same songs over and over again, which means it's rarely wrong, but gets old quickly. We tend to go the other way, and we're like only one song, so these things will have 200 bands. Because we are not that good at it, there'll be a fair amount of variety in that because we're trying to be very focused on what we miss. So we don't, in practical terms, have the problem of only feeding you the stuff that sounds exactly like what you know, because we're trying to, but we get it wrong. But the topic of broadening your horizons is a super interesting one, and that each person's tolerance for how rapidly to take them out of their comfort zone is different too. So we have this relatively new feature called Discover Weekly, which basically makes you a mixtape every week. And internally it pulls from stuff we think you are familiar with and stuff we think you are not familiar with in an attempt to do what you're saying. The most obvious problem with that is we only know what you listen to on Spotify. So you listen to the Pixies and we look like, wow, Sonic Youth is like somewhat similar to the Pixies. The person who's never listened to Sonic Youth, you're going to be so psyched to hear Sonic Youth. And I'm like, okay, you, I know what Sonic Youth. I just didn't listen to them on Spotify in the 3 months since I signed up. So we always have partial information about what the user knows, so it's hard. But this is super interesting to us because the more engaged you are with the wider world of music, the more likely you are to not decide to stop paying. Like if you just listen to this is why we have anything other than a search box. Because if while we have a search box, you look at the albums that you know, you listen to them, then you're done. Like maybe I'll go watch TV instead, or like throw a boomerang. And like these are our enemies. Anything else in the world you would do instead of listening. If it's exclusively listening to music, you can do other things while you're listening to music. That's all.
All right, well, we'll have to bring this to a close, but thank you.